All right, this is lecture 5.1. This whole unit is about agriculture. It will start off with a little bit of the history of how we get to where we're at in agriculture, the types of agriculture, and then we'll start looking at global trends in both small and large commercial agriculture and its impact on the world. So we're going to jump right in to understand how we got from no agriculture to agriculture. Before we figure out agriculture, before we go through the first agricultural revolution, every human being was a hunter-gatherer of some sort, various different things that they're hunting and gathering. But that is before about 10,000 BCE. First agricultural revolution happens around 10,000, 9,000-ish BCE, so about 12,000-ish years ago, depending on the region. And that is when humans first start to figure out how to domesticate animals and domesticate crops. So they start selecting for different aspects of crops and start deliberately growing them. Okay? And the hearths for that, so the very earliest ones, so you're looking at the red, would be the Middle East, parts of China and South Asia, in India. Are the kind of initial areas. They are, for noting diffusion, they are simultaneous hearths. So it didn't all start in the Middle East and then spread out all over the world from the Middle East, but kind of simultaneously, roughly simultaneously, China, India, and the Middle East, and somewhat Central America and Sub-Saharan Africa, figure out some kind of farming. And you can see the different colors is when they domesticate different crops. And also different animals. But the diffusion was regional, so it would be mostly like very small relocation diffusion as humans are migrating. They're bringing their knowledge of their basic domestication of animals and crops with them, and then it would be a little bit of contagious whenever they migrated and settled someplace new. So mostly relocation, and then some contagious. Eventually, once we get into like empire building, then you'll get into hierarchical. But initially, they are multiple simultaneous hearths, so all at the same time, humans just kind of figure it out. The connection to environmental determinism, going back to Unit 1, think Jared Diamond, Guns, Germs, and Steel, and documentary we watched, is that in those areas, Central America, also known, you'll see Mesoamerica, the Middle East, South Asia, East Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, is they all had the ideal climate and they also had the ideal crops and animals. So those places had grains or crops like beans, for example, or corn that could store for a long time, sometimes for years without rotting, compared to like the mango or taro that you see over here in in the Pacific Islands. And then they also had animals that were domesticatable, so like the ox, especially in Eurasia, not in North and South America. They had the ox, horse, pigs, goats, sheep, cows, etc. So animals that were more easy to domesticate than, say, like if you think of like South Africa with zebras and lions or tigers over in South Asia, for example. North and South America only had the llama and alpaca. There was nothing else that they were able to domesticate successfully on a broad scale. So an environmental determinist said these are the hearths because they had the ideal geography with the right climate, the right domestic native plants and animals that could be domesticated compared to other areas. Okay. Moving on, so the next big movement of crops before we get into any other agricultural revolutions is the Columbian Exchange, thinking back again to 9th grade world history. And this is where those same animals that we were just talking about, they had been kind of traded within the continent. So Eurasia to Africa, they had all of those, again, Chinese, Indian, European, Middle Eastern, North African crops. And those were circulating there within those continents. And then North and South America had some circulation, mostly because it gets so narrow there in Central America, not a lot between North and South. So within South America and then within North America, trade. Once enough knowledge of math and map making and ships When Europeans start traveling over to North and South America, taking enslaved people with them, then you get this massive exchange of all these crops and animals and all the other things like disease, if you remember from ninth grade, and that is called the Columbian Exchange. So it's 14, 15, 16, 1700s, the exchange of all these crops and animals, among other things, between all the continents now. So before it had been kind of within continents or regions. Okay, and so again, that is because it's colonization that's happening. You obviously have relocation, but there's a hierarchical diffusion element to that too. And then when things would land, things would take off, like the potato or coffee, for example. So then you get a contagious element and stimulus. But the dominant diffusion would be hierarchical because it's colonization, and then relocation because people are moving. Okay. All right, so that's a little bit of the start of agriculture, and now we're just going to look briefly at the types of agriculture we're going to be talking about. First is subsistence. So when humans, jumping back a slide, when humans 12,000, 11,000-ish years ago, or later, depending on where they are, when they start farming, they are doing subsistence farming, and that is farming for yourself, your family, maybe a small village group. You are not trying to get commercial gain. Sometimes there might be like a tiny little side hustle or something, but their dominant goal is not making income off of it. Their dominant goal is to feed themselves, their family, maybe contributing to a small village group that they're kind of communally working together. About 70% of global farmers are still subsistence farmers. And part of this unit will look at the challenge of jumping from subsistence. So say someone wanted to continue to farm but needed to make an income, the challenge in making that jump. So again, farming for your family, about 70% of farmers' subsistence. The other form is commercial farming, and that is farming for a market for financial gain. And that was somewhat existed before the Columbian Exchange. Columbian Exchange really kicks off with all the plantations fueled by enslaved labor, is when commercial farming really takes off on a bigger scale. And then obviously it's massive today. Prior to that, there was some commercial farming and trade along the Silk Road, but it was not, again, Columbian Exchange, early globalization in the 15, 16, 1700s is when commercial farming really takes off. Okay, and commercial farming is based on what are known as cash crops. You think back to the Columbian Exchange or even today, those are things like coffee, chocolate, cotton, soy, corn, wheat, etc. Anything can be technically a cash crop, but when you think of that term, it's the things that are lucrative crops, or tend to be lucrative crops. Okay? The two other categories when we're talking about agriculture this year, and it can be subsistence or commercial, either, can be practiced intensively, and that is where there is a lot of input, so that can be human input or physical inputs like fertilizers, water, etc., resources. So a lot of resource input on a small amount of land. So that could be like tomatoes or dairy farming or poultry farming. So usually chicken or turkey, for example, or duck. Sometimes they're even indoors. Those require less land, and it's more things kind of crammed into one area, or they need less land to grow. So tomatoes or a lot of kind of perishable vegetables are intensive. So they need a lot more care. They can, if they're using pesticides, use a lot more inputs like that. And again, less land. Okay. Extensive farming is where there are fewer inputs needed, but it's on much more land. So think like big grain farms or ranching operations where the animals are wide ranging and they need less daily care. So like a dairy farm needs daily milking. If it's ranching for just beef or leather or whatever, they need less daily care if they're doing kind of a bigger area, unless it's like a feedlot. So again, extensive is where there's fewer daily inputs needed, or the crops or animals need less resources, but much more land. So again, can be subsistence or commercial, but there's intensive or extensive. It needs extensive land. And that's it for this lecture. Make sure to take care of the quiz before you wrap up.